In this video, we're continuing our interview with Brett Guarino, VCDX number 256. He's discussing the core terminology and concepts that every VCDX candidate needs to know.
Hi everyone, I'm Brian Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you are in the right place. Start now by subscribing and clicking the bell so that you don't miss anything.
Welcome back, everyone. We're continuing our interview with Mr. VCDX 256, Brett Guarino. And in this particular part, we're going to be talking about conceptual model. Why don't you take it away, Brett?
So here we're looking at the components that make up the conceptual model. And you're looking at requirements first. That's going to be entirely based, or those will be entirely based on your business drivers. And you frankly should have a lot of requirements in your design. The more you listen to your customer, the more you can gather their data and extrapolate something meaningful from the information you get from them, whether they're technical assets or business-related assets to the organization with whom you're working. That's where you're going to get the bulk of your information, okay? And a requirement is going to be something that's going to set the stage for you to be able to make a decision based on what the business has told you it needs. Whereas a constraint, on the other hand, is going to be something where the business is telling you, look, I need something, but you're not going to be able to make a decision in how we achieve the goal of realizing that particular business driver. Okay, you don't have the option of making a decision. I'm the customer, and I'm going to make that decision for you. And I like to often refer to this as he who has the gold, or she who has the gold, makes the rules. So when we're talking about a constraint, we're really looking at something where the architect no longer has the power to effectively make a decision to accommodate the customer's need. And when you're looking at that as the consideration, it's really easy to differentiate between requirements and constraints. And I know this video is geared towards VCDX candidates, but that also is something that's going to extend to anyone who's looking at a VCAP deploy. You should be able to identify the difference between a requirement and a constraint. And the big difference is going to boil down to a single word, and that word is choice. If I, as the architect, have the ability to make a decision in how I'm going to accommodate the customer requirement, then it is in fact a requirement if I have the power to choose. If the customer makes the choice of the decision for me, for example, they tell me I have to use a particular vendor or a particular model or a particular software version or a particular piece of software, or I'm limited in terms of a budget, something that restricts my power as the architect to choose how I'm going to deal with the customer's needs. That is in fact a constraint, okay? And I always like to drive that point home. That's a really big point because I see so many people taking their VCAP design exams and students who are in our classrooms have trouble with that particular topic. So that's always one of the big key takeaways that I want to see people leave anything that I have to do with the conceptual model with. I want to see them take that away. And because it's something that I too had issues with. Assumptions or anything where as an architect, I don't have enough of data to be able to actually define a requirement or a constraint. And it's possible that in time, as I'm going through a design process and working with a customer in the first meeting, I'm going to have a lot of assumptions. In the second meeting and the third meeting, I should have fewer and fewer assumptions, and I should have more and more requirements and potentially constraints. Anytime that I have an assumption, it is worth noting that you should also have a risk associated with that assumption. Anywhere there's just an assumption, there is a possibility for something to go wrong. We all know what assumptions do. So the fact that that's a design element, it inherently introduces risk. So if I have an assumption, I should probably have an associated risk. Anywhere that I have a risk, it's a threat to the design, plain and simple. And what I want to see in association with any risk is going to be a risk mitigation strategy. And your risk mitigation strategy for dealing with that risk, should the risk manifest itself as part of the reality of your actual implementation or day-to-day life in this design, you should have consideration for how we'll deal with it if it manifests itself. And that consideration is the, again, risk mitigation strategy, which should be detailed in your standard operating procedures documents. So just in this small discussion about this introductory piece on conceptual model, you can see how your documentation begins to grow and grow and grow, because this is really the foundation for your design document. But you're required to submit several documents for the VCDX, one of which is your standard operating procedures document. You can see how that would be influenced to grow by the fact that you've just got risks in the design, and now you've got to have risk mitigation strategies, and you're going to introduce how you're going to deal with that risk if it becomes reality.
All right. I got to say, I really appreciate the way you described those 4 terms, because you didn't just define the terms, you also showed relationships between them. I'd encourage, again, anyone who's prepping for VCDX or VCAP design to rewind this video and listen to Brett again and get those concepts into your head. They're not just willy-nilly terms. They mean things and they have a relationship to each other. All right, so taking a look at our slide here, up top I see the title says Conceptual Model. What does Conceptual Model have to do with conceptual design from our previous video? Are those the same thing? Are they different? Or why they both say conceptual?
Yeah, because it's not exactly logical. It's not exactly something that we can touch or feel or actually implement. You can do a conceptual model, but it's going to be extremely, extremely basic, right? And this gets us into an argument that if you put any handful of architects together in any space, there's going to be some disagreement in how this actually gets addressed, right? For me, the value in this is, can you translate a business driver from the customer into this model and actually do this? And this is largely done in text, right? But you will see people draw up models, like actual models where they're creating relational diagrams between these things. And that's not a bad thing to do. I mean, if you're comfortable with that, go for it. In the context of VCDX, my conceptual model would be something extremely simple. In a conceptual model where I was actually going to draft a diagram, I'm not going to mention anything like product names. I'm certainly not going to be mentioning anything beyond something like maybe compute or storage or network. I wouldn't go any deeper than that when defining a conceptual model consideration. Now, that's me personally, and that doesn't mean that it's right, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, because I've seen this done so many different ways. And I've also seen some knockdown, drag-out arguments over this when you get into the right audiences. And I personally don't necessarily have too much of an investment in either side of those arguments. VCDX is largely influenced by TOGAF and Zachman frameworks, but there are a ton of industry frameworks that may not necessarily agree when it comes to the actual consideration of conceptual modeling versus conceptual diagrams versus logical diagrams versus logical modeling. And frankly, in my estimation, when it comes to VCDX, it would benefit you to be familiar with TOGAF and Zachman. But beyond that, I wouldn't say that you're required to present it a certain way, or that even the panelists are too invested in those particular ideas. What they're looking for is your ability to actually translate what the customer needs into requirements, constraints, assumptions, and risks, and how you're going to deal with those, and subsequently use that as the foundation for your logical model.
One of the things that I've encountered when discussing these 4 terms with students in the classroom is the last term there, risks. Risks, the reaction from some customers, some students is, well, why would I want to call out the risks? If I put risks into any sort of documentation I'd give to the customer, isn't that just going to show that my design's not good, or that I, the architect, am not doing a good job? Why should I list the risks?
You absolutely want to list the risks, because your design that you're going to hand off to the customer and the customer is subsequently going to sign off on is actually, I tend to think of this as a contract between myself as the architect and the customer as the individual who is buying off on my solution to their business problems and their business needs. So when the customer comes back and says, why did this happen? If I, as the architect, did my job properly, I should have the ability to point to a risk in the design and say, you were made aware of the fact that this was a risk, and we do have a risk mitigation strategy for it. It's going to cost you the following amount of money. This was all defined in some conceptual consideration or theoretical consideration, and it was detailed in the standard operating procedure, all of which is documentation that the customer signed off on at some point and agreed to. So risks are not necessarily weaknesses. They're, again, I would say threats to the design that we want to have acknowledged and agreed upon, that the customer is not willing to engage in any type of mitigation to address those risks. at the point in time in which we will implement this, and the customer will purchase this particular design and solution that goes along with it. So I absolutely don't tend to want to push this as an idea of exposing weakness, and it's weaknesses that we acknowledge in the design, and it could be something as simple as identifying single points of failure. You certainly want to make your customer aware of the fact that we do have something like a single point of failure, maybe on the network cards or the IO cards, and we want to acknowledge this could fail. And we want to acknowledge as well, theoretically, if it were to fail, does it cause a violation of my customer's SLA relative to availability? If we're going to violate the customer SLA relative to availability, then I certainly want to make sure that the customer is aware of that fact, because they may be willing to cough up some more money to avoid that particular configuration prior to us going to implementation. Makes sense.
So risks, spelling out risks with customers makes sense, but what about having risks in your design when you go in for your VCDX defense? Are they going to kick it back? You won't even get to do your defense?
No, absolutely not. I'd say you should have as many risks as you can identify, and as many risk mitigation strategies as you have risks, minimally. And that should be documented again in your SOP, your standard operating procedures documentation that you submit. For example, my very first submission of my VCDX, I had, I want to say, between 11 and 14 risks. It wasn't many at all. My final submission, I had, I think, 80 risks. So the idea that you can have too many risks is not necessarily a bad thing. It shows that you had the foresight, the vision, and the ability to recognize where the design was weak, and you documented it, and the customer signed off on it. Again, it becomes a contractual obligation where if one of these things actually takes place, the customer can be upset with it, but they can't say that they didn't know about it before you actually did the design and subsequent implementation.
All right, one last question before we move on to our next video. Again, we've got here in the slide, requirements, constraints, assumptions, and risks. Where's a VCDX candidate to go to learn more about those? What resources do they have available?
I would certainly always point people towards the blueprint. And if you're a VCDX candidate, when I make that statement, you're someone who's a VCIX, and you may or may not have put pen to paper just yet. If you're in that role, you should certainly go to vcdx.vmware.com and identify who is currently acting in the role of mentor. And you want to get with someone who's an existing VCDX, who's gone through the process relatively recently or is actively involved with it and has been mentoring for some time. And you want to work with that person to help you clarify any confusion you have about any of these things. To that note and to that effect, there are some wonderful existing VCDXs who are mentors, and some who are not mentors, but they have phenomenal blogs that are available. If you type in VCDX and blog, you'll get a ton of them. I don't want to necessarily give out preference to anyone in particular, but there's a bunch that help me tremendously, even in just Googling VCDX and blog, or something like VCDX and any one of these particular considerations. Like if you type in VCDX and conceptual, you'll see blogs pop up. And a lot of these people are extremely accessible, myself included. They're accessible via Twitter and other social media platforms, and very, very willing to help in answering questions. I will say there's also some Slack groups for VCDX that are public and available, and I think there's a Google group as well that's available. Even VMware Communities is a place where you could go and get some help with any of these concepts. And just because someone has an opinion on this that's not a VCDX doesn't mean that their opinion is invalid. I would absolutely say that as well. Okay, it's not that anyone who's a VCDX is anointed with some knowledge that is coveted and held exclusively by VCDXs. I've sat through design classes with you, Brian, and there are things that I've learned working with you on that. So it always helps to be humble and open to other ideas. And you can always bounce it off of someone who's been through the process and say, hey, what do you think about this? Again, these people are largely very accessible, and they've documented a lot of their journey and their experience out on the interwebs.
Okay, that's quite a few different resources available to our VCDX candidates out there on the internet. So again, that'll wrap us up for this particular video. Join us in the next video where we've got some more core concepts. Remember to subscribe and join me in the next video where we continue our interview with Brett Guarino.